morning my wife told the courtroom I was nothing. I was 63 years old, and I had just finished pouring her coffee the way she liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. No more, no less. I'd been doing it for 37 years, and I still measured the cream against the inside of the mug, because she could tell, somehow, when I was lazy about it. She didn't thank me. She hadn't thanked me for that coffee in maybe 20 years. I'm not bitter about it. I'm just telling you what was true. My name doesn't matter much for this story, but I'll tell you anyway because it feels strange to talk about myself for this long without saying it. People called me Wendell most of my life. When, if they were close, nobody had called me Wendell in a long while. I want to start somewhere before the courtroom, because if I jump straight to the part where she stood up in front of the judge and called me a useless husband, you won't understand why I sat still and let her say it. You won't understand the quiet, and the quiet is the whole thing. So I'll start with my mother. Her name was Hattie, and she was 81 the year all of this came apart. She lived in a yellow house outside of Asheville, North Carolina, on a road where the mailboxes leaned like old men and the dogwood trees bloomed white every April. My father had built that house with his hands in 1962, and after he died in 2009, my mother stayed in it because she said his fingerprints were still on the door frames, and she wasn't ready to let go of them. My wife, Bridget, had never liked that house. She said it smelled like camphor and old magazines. She said my mother was a hoarder, which wasn't true. My mother just kept things. There's a difference, though. Bridget never accepted it. Bridget had grown up in a house where nothing was ever old. Her mother replaced the couch every 5 years. Her father drove a new car every 3. They threw out Christmas cards the day after Christmas. When I married her in 1987, I thought her tidiness was a virtue. I came to understand later that some people don't like clutter because some people don't like attachments. We had 2 children, a son, Calder, who is 34 now and works for an insurance company in Charlotte, a daughter, Brielle, who is 31 and teaches 3rd grade in Raleigh. I love them both more than I have words for. I want to be clear about that before I tell you the next part, because the next part will sound like I don't. The trouble started about 3 years ago when my mother had her first small stroke. It wasn't a bad one. The doctor used the word warning. She lost a little use of her left hand and she got slower with her words, like she was searching the room for them. But she was still herself, still made her own breakfast, still hummed church hymns when she was washing dishes. She needed help, though. Someone to drive her to appointments, someone to pick up groceries, someone to read the bills out loud because her eyes had gotten worse. I started driving up to Asheville every Friday after work and staying through Sunday night. It was a 4-hour drive each way from where Bridget and I lived in Greenville, South Carolina. I retired from my main career 2 years before that, but I still did consulting work 3 days a week from a home office, so my weekends were free. Bridget hated this arrangement from the start. She said I was abandoning her. She said my mother had a perfectly nice assisted living facility she could move into. She said the yellow house wasn't safe. What Bridget didn't know, and this is where the quiet starts, is that my mother's house was paid off, fully and clearly, and was worth about $400,000 on the open market. My father had also left my mother an investment account with somewhere north of $600,000 in it, because my father, God rest him, had been a careful man with money and had worked 38 years at a paper mill putting away every penny he could. My mother didn't talk about money. She was from a generation that thought talking about money was vulgar. But she had told me after my father's funeral that everything would come to me when she went. She said it once, quietly, in the kitchen with her hand on my wrist. She said, "Your father wanted you to have it because you're the one who'll know what to do with it." I had 2 younger sisters, but one had passed in 2014, and the other had moved to Australia decades ago and hadn't been home in 15 years. I never told Bridget about the money, not the exact amount. I told her vaguely that my mother had something put away, and Bridget had asked once or twice, casually, what that meant. I had been vague. I had been vague. I want to tell you why I was vague, and I'm going to be honest, because there's no point in this story if I'm not. By 2018, I had figured out something about my wife that I hadn't wanted to figure out. She had been having an affair, on and off, for about 6 years, with a man who lived 2 streets over. His name was Pruitt. He sold commercial real estate. I knew about him because I am, by training and by long career, a forensic accountant. I had spent 31 years before retirement examining bank statements and credit card records and figuring out who was lying about what. I did not need a private investigator to figure out my wife. I needed a Saturday afternoon and our shared checking account. I didn't confront her. I want to explain that because a lot of people who hear this story say I should have. I didn't confront her because I had two children who still believed their parents had a happy marriage. And I had a mother in Asheville who was starting to forget the names of the dogwood trees. And I had a job that I loved and a quiet little life, and I did not want to set fire to all of it on a Tuesday in November. I also didn't confront her because I am, by nature and by profession, patient. I watch. I take notes. I wait for the picture to fill in. My father used to say that a man in a hurry is a man who hasn't figured out what he wants. I knew what I wanted. I wanted to keep my children's lives intact until they were grown enough to weather what was coming. I wanted to take care of my mother, and I wanted, when the day came, to walk away with my dignity and my pension and my piece of what my father had left. So I waited. I waited 5 years. In those 5 years, I drove to Asheville every weekend. I helped my mother set up a trust with a lawyer named Coraline Whitfield, who had been my father's attorney for 2 decades. We made sure the house and the investment account were placed in an irrevocable trust with me as the sole beneficiary, structured so that it could not be touched by any spouse of mine in any divorce in any state in the Union. Coraline drew it up, airtight. She made me sign in 3 different colors of ink. That's how careful she was. My mother knew exactly what we were doing. She was old, not stupid, and she had never liked Bridget either. She said it the day we signed the trust. She said, "Your wife smiles too much for somebody who has so little to smile about." That was my mother. Sharp as a tack right up until the end. I did not tell Bridget about the trust. I told her my mother and I had gotten her affairs in order, which is the kind of phrase you can say at a dinner party and nobody asks a follow-up question. In those same 5 years, I also began, quietly, to separate my own financial life from Bridget's. I rolled my consulting income into an account she didn't have access to, in a credit union 3 counties away. I redirected my Social Security deposits to a different account. I let our joint checking handle the household expenses, and I deposited just enough into it each month to keep things looking normal. Bridget never noticed because Bridget had her own account, with money I'd assumed was hers, that she used for what she called her personal expenses. It was Pruitt's. I figured that out in year 4. He was, in addition to being a real estate broker, somewhat wealthy, and he had been quietly funding my wife's lifestyle for a long time. Hair appointments, a Cadillac SUV, a series of weekend girls' trips to Charleston that were not girls' trips. I had the records. I had photographs. I had a binder and a fireproof safe in a storage unit that nobody in the world knew about except me. I am not telling you this to make myself sound clever. I'm telling you so you understand what was sitting in my chest the morning Bridget served me with divorce papers. It was a Wednesday in March of last year. My mother had passed away the previous October. The funeral was small. Bridget came dressed in black and squeezed my hand at the graveside and made the appropriate face. She had not spoken to my mother in 11 years. After the funeral, things between us got worse, fast. I think Bridget had been waiting for my mother to die because she'd assumed, in some part of her mind, that there would now be money, and she'd assumed that money would be ours. She started asking, finally, the questions she'd avoided asking for 30 years. How much? Where was it? When was it being transferred? I gave her vague answers because I had always given her vague answers, and I didn't see any reason to start being specific now. I told her my mother's estate was complicated. I told her there was a trust situation. I told her my mother's lawyer was still working through it. Bridget's patience, which had never been long, ran out in February. She called me one evening in the kitchen, a series of names I won't repeat. She said I had been hiding things from her for our entire marriage. She said I was selfish. She said I was emotionally absent. She said the children agreed with her, which was a lie, because I'd spoken to both of them that same week and they hadn't said any such thing. And then, in March, she filed. The papers came to the house in a manila envelope, hand-delivered by a process server who looked apologetic. The petition cited irreconcilable differences, which is what they all cite. But the attached financial discovery request was a piece of work. She was asking for half of everything. Half the house, half my pension, half my Social Security, half my inherited assets, which she had estimated in writing at $1,200,000. She wanted the Greenville house and the lake cabin and the Cadillac SUV. which I had not known until that moment that I had even technically paid for. But the title was indeed in my name. She wanted spousal support of $4,500 a month for the rest of my natural life. And she wanted me to pay her attorney's fees. Of course she did. I read the papers twice. I made myself a sandwich. I called Coraline Whitfield, my mother's old lawyer, and I asked her to recommend somebody in South Carolina who specialized in high-conflict divorce. Coraline gave me a name. I called the name. I scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday. When I hung up the phone, I sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the bird feeder my mother had given me for my 40th birthday. I sat there for a long time. I did not cry exactly. I did something quieter than that. I let go of 37 years. The lawyer Coraline recommended was a woman named Henrietta Pemberton Reeve. She was about my age, with silver hair pulled back in a clip and reading glasses on a chain. Her office was on the third floor of a brick building downtown, and the first thing she said to me after she shook my hand was, "Sit down and tell me everything from the beginning. Don't leave out the parts that make you look bad. The parts that make you look bad are usually the parts that win." I told her everything. I told her about the affair. I told her about Pruitt. I told her about the trust my mother and I had set up. I told her about the storage unit. I told her about the consulting income and the credit union 3 counties away. I told her about the photographs. She listened without writing anything down. When I was finished, she took her reading glasses off and folded them carefully on her desk and said, "Wendell, your wife has made a tactical error." I said, "What's that?" She said, "She thinks you're a fool." The first thing Bridget's attorney did was file a motion for what's called the Standing Order Restraining Asset Dissipation. It's a legal mechanism that's supposed to keep one spouse from hiding or transferring money during divorce proceedings. Her attorney, a man named Roderick Vance, whom I will say more about in a minute, argued that I had been hiding inherited assets and that the court should freeze all my accounts immediately. The judge granted a partial order. Henrietta had expected this and was unbothered. She told me to do nothing, change nothing, transfer nothing. Let them look. She said, "Let them look at every account, every statement, every receipt. The trust is solid. Your separate accounts are documented. There's nothing to find that hurts you. There's a great deal to find that hurts her." What Bridget did next surprised even Henrietta a little. She went to my consulting clients. She wrote letters, polite, concerned letters on nice stationery, suggesting that I had been exhibiting concerning behavior and that questions had been raised about my professional judgment. She didn't quite accuse me of anything. She didn't have to. The letters did their work. 2 of my 4 clients quietly let me go within a month. A third put me on what he called an indefinite hold. I lost about 70% of my consulting income in 6 weeks. Henrietta added the letters to a folder. She said, "We'll use these. Don't worry about them. Worry less. Worry not at all." I tried. It was harder than she made it sound. Then Bridget escalated again. She filed an emergency motion alleging that I had been financially controlling throughout our marriage, that I had isolated her from her own resources, and that I was now retaliating against her by undermining her standard of living. She asked for emergency spousal support of $6,000 a month, pending the final divorce. Henrietta and I went to that hearing in May. It was the first time I had been in a courtroom in 12 years, and the first time I had been in one as a party rather than as an expert witness. I wore the gray suit I'd worn to my mother's funeral. I sat very still, and I did not speak unless I was spoken to. Bridget took the stand. She was wearing a blue dress I'd never seen before, and pearls that I suspected Pruitt had bought her. She cried at the appropriate moments. She told the judge I had refused to discuss money with her for our entire marriage. She told the judge I had hidden my mother's death benefits from her. She told the judge I had become emotionally erratic since my mother's passing, and that she feared sometimes what I might do. She used the phrase "useless husband" once then. I heard it. I did not react. The judge, who was a woman of about 70 with a face like a closed door, listened to all of this with no expression at all. Then Henrietta got up. Henrietta did not cross-examine Bridget that day. She did something else. She submitted into evidence the financial records I had been quietly compiling for 5 years. She submitted bank statements showing Pruitt's transfers into Bridget's personal account going back to 2018. She submitted photographs. She submitted hotel receipts. She submitted a single email, which Bridget had sent to Pruitt in 2021, that contained a sentence I won't repeat here, but which made the judge's eyebrows climb half an inch up her forehead. Then Henrietta submitted the letters Bridget had written to my consulting clients. Then she submitted my mother's trust documentation, properly executed and notarized in 2019, 2 full years before Bridget had ever asked a question about my mother's estate. The judge took 20 minutes to read it all. The courtroom was quiet. Bridget's attorney, Roderick Vance, shifted in his chair like the chair had grown teeth. When the judge looked up, she did not grant the emergency spousal support. She did not grant any of Bridget's requests. She set the matter for full trial in October, and she added, dryly, that she expected both parties to conduct themselves with greater honesty going forward. In the hallway after Bridget walked past me without looking at me, Pruitt was waiting for her outside in the Cadillac. The trial was held over 2 days in late October of last year. I won't take you through all of it because most of it was procedure, and most procedure is boring. I'll take you to the moment that matters. It was the second day. The afternoon session. Bridget was on the stand again, and this time her attorney, Roderick, had her telling a long story about how I had emotionally neglected her, how I had checked out of our marriage, how I had become a ghost in my own home. She said the phrase again. She said, "He was just a useless husband, Your Honor. That's the truth of it. He gave me nothing for 37 years. He gave me nothing emotionally. He gave me nothing financially. He gave me nothing of himself." I was sitting at the petitioner's table very still with my hands folded in my lap. I did not look at Bridget. I looked at the seal of the state of South Carolina behind the judge's head. The judge let the moment sit. Then she leaned forward, slowly, and she looked not at Bridget but at Roderick Vance. She said, "Mr. Vance, a question, if I may." Roderick stood up. He said, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge said, "How long have you represented Mrs. Pemberton?" He said, "About 8 months, Your Honor." The judge said, "And in those 8 months, Mr. Vance, did you ever once think to ask your client what her husband did for a living?" Roderick blinked. He looked at Bridget. Bridget had gone very still on the stand. He said, "Your Honor, my understanding is that he was an accountant." The judge said, "Your understanding is incomplete, Mr. Vance." She turned to me. She looked at me for the first time in 2 days like I was a person and not a file. She said, "Sir, would you state for the record the full nature of your professional history?" I stood up. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I said, "Your Honor, I worked for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division for 19 years. After that, I worked as a forensic accountant for the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of North Carolina for 12 more years. I retired from federal service in 2017. Since then, I have done consulting work for 3 district attorneys' offices in North and South Carolina, primarily on cases involving financial fraud, asset concealment, and marital embezzlement." The courtroom was very quiet. The judge said, "Thank you, sir. You may sit." She turned back to Roderick Vance. She said, "Mr. Vance, your client has spent the last hour testifying that her husband was financially negligent, emotionally absent, and a useless husband. She has also, in her petition, accused him of hiding assets in a manner that would constitute fraud. You are aware, are you not, that this gentleman has spent the better part of 40 years investigating financial fraud at the federal level?" Roderick opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He said, "Your Honor, my client did not. I was not made aware of the full." The judge said, "Mr. Vance, you really didn't know who he was, did you?" Roderick did not answer. He sat down. I want to tell you what Bridget's face did in that moment, because I watched it. The color drained out of her cheeks slowly, from the top down, like somebody letting water out of a glass. Her mouth opened, just slightly, and her eyes flicked over to Roderick and then over to Pruitt, who was sitting in the back row, and then down to her hands. She had assumed for 37 years that the quiet man pouring her coffee did not see her. She had assumed that because he did not speak, he did not know. She had assumed that because he did not fight, he did not have weapons. She had assumed that because he did not have weapons. She had assumed wrong. The judge ruled the following week. I'll give you the short version because the long version is a stack of paper 4 inches thick. Bridget received no portion of my mother's trust. The trust held exactly as Coraline had drawn it up. She received no spousal support because the court determined that her own undisclosed income from Pruitt had been more than sufficient to maintain her standard of living throughout the marriage and would continue to do so. She received half the equity in the Greenville house because South Carolina is an equitable distribution state and the house was marital property. She received nothing of my pension because federal pensions of that type are protected, and she had signed a prenuptial waiver in 1987 that her own attorney, in 1987, had advised her to sign and that she had forgotten about. She did not receive the lake cabin because the lake cabin was in the trust. She did not receive my consulting income because the court determined on Henrietta's motion that her interference with my clients had constituted tortious interference and that I was entitled to recover damages from her, not the other way around. She had to pay her own attorney's fees. She had to pay a portion of mine. She had to repay, to the marital estate, the funds she had received from Pruitt that had been commingled with marital accounts, a sum that came out to just over $110,000. She walked out of that courtroom with about 40 cents on the dollar of what she had walked in expecting. I want to tell you about my children now, because they're the part of this that still hurts. Calder believed his mother first. Of course he did. Bridget had been telling him for years that I was distant and cold, and Calder, who is sensitive and who looks like her, had absorbed that story without examining it. When the divorce filing went public, he stopped returning my calls for about 4 months. Brielle was different. Brielle is more like me. She had questions. She came down to Greenville in May, right after the first hearing, and she sat in my kitchen and she said, "Daddy, I need you to tell me what is true." So I told her. I told her about the affair. I showed her the binder. I did not show her the photographs because I did not want her to carry those, but I showed her the bank records and the hotel receipts in the email. I told her about Pruitt. I told her about my mother's trust and why I had set it up. I told her about the letters Bridget had written to my consulting clients. Brielle did not cry while I was talking. She cried after, in the car, and then she came back inside and she put her arms around me and she said, "Daddy, I am so sorry I didn't see it." I said, "Honey, you weren't supposed to see it. I kept it from you on purpose." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because you needed a mother. Both of you did. I wasn't going to be the one to take her from you. She had to do that herself." Brielle talked to Calder. Calder talked to me. It took a long time. It took more than a year, actually, and we are still working on it. He came to Thanksgiving last November. He didn't bring his mother. He brought a casserole, which he had made himself, and which was terrible, and which I ate 2 helpings of because he was trying. He and I sat on the back porch after dinner. He didn't apologize exactly. He said, "Dad, I should have asked you." Before I assumed, I said, "Son, you were taught not to." By somebody who knew exactly what she was doing. He nodded. He looked out at the yard for a long time. Then he said, "How did you stay quiet for so long?" I thought about that for a while. I said, "Because the loudest thing in the room is usually wrong, and because I knew that one day somebody would ask the right question." He said, "What question?" I said, "Who he is. I live alone now in the yellow house outside Asheville. I sold the Greenville house. I gave Bridget her share. She moved in with Pruitt for about 3 months, until Pruitt's wife, yes, Pruitt had a wife, which Bridget had also not known, found out and threw both of them out. Bridget now lives in an apartment off Highway 17. I hear about her sometimes from people who don't know better than to mention her name to me. She's not doing well. I am sorry for that, in the way you are sorry for somebody you used to know. The dogwoods bloomed this April. I sat on the porch and I drank coffee that I made the way I like it, not the way she liked it, and I watched the white blossoms shake in the wind. Brielle calls me every Sunday. Calder calls me every other Wednesday. My grandson, who is 4, calls me Pop Pop and thinks I am the funniest person on earth, which is not true, but which I am not going to correct him about. My mother's bird feeder is on the porch railing. I keep it full. I want to say one thing to whoever is listening to this, because I know some of you are sitting where I was sitting, and I know some of you have been told for a long time that your quiet means you are nothing. Your quiet is not nothing. Your quiet is the room where you are keeping yourself safe until the day the right question is asked. The day will come. It might take 5 years. It might take 37, but somebody, eventually, will lean forward and look at the person speaking against you and say, "You really don't know who he is, do you?" And on that day, you will stand up and you will tell them. And the quiet will have done its work. I've thought about this a great deal since the courtroom emptied out, and the thing I keep coming back to is how quietly cause and effect work in a life. Bridget did not wake up one morning and decide to ruin our marriage. She made a small choice, and then a smaller one, and then another, over many years, and each choice grew out of the one before it the way a vine grows along a fence. The lying built the next lie. The taking built the next lie. The taking built the next taking. By the time she stood in that courtroom calling me useless, she had built so much of her life on a story about me that wasn't true that she could no longer remember the man she had married. That is what dishonesty does. It eats the person doing it from the inside out, slowly, while they're still convinced they're winning. I want to say something about the quiet, because some people have heard parts of this story and told me I should have spoken up sooner. They mean well, but I have come to believe that there is a difference between the quiet that comes from fear and the quiet that comes from knowing. Fear quiet shrinks a man. Knowing quiet steadies him. For 37 years, I held my tongue, not because I was afraid of Bridget, but because I understood that some truths have to be allowed to ripen on their own, and that a man who reaches for them too early ends up with nothing in his hand worth keeping. What I would say to any man my age who is listening, who feels invisible in his own house, is this: your worth is not a thing your wife or your children or your employer hands to you. It is a thing you build, one careful day at a time, in private, when nobody is watching and nobody is clapping. My father built a house with his hands. My mother kept faith with that house for 50 years after he was gone. They did not need anybody to tell them they mattered. They knew because they had done the work. Integrity is a slow currency. It does not pay out in the moments you want it to. It pays out, eventually, in courtrooms and on porches, and in the moment your grown daughter puts her arms around you and says she is sorry she did not see. It pays out in the look on a judge's face when she finally understands which person in front of her has been telling the truth. It pays out when you can sit alone in your mother's yellow house, watching the dogwoods bloom, and know that you did not betray yourself to get there. I am 64 years old now, and I have learned, late, that the strongest thing a man can do is refuse to become the thing he is being accused of. Stay decent. Keep your records. Tell the truth to the few people who deserve it, and let the rest of the world catch up when it's ready. It will. The right question always gets asked. You only have to be the kind of man who has the right answer waiting.